All right. It's still morning, so good morning for the second time. I'm going to call our budget overview meeting to order. Recognize we have a full quorum of county commissioners who've been here for 3 hours and haven't been fed yet, so we'll try to get through this without anybody getting hangry, I guess, and that'd probably be me. I'm going to start the process, let Tom go through the budget process, what we can expect. It's our first of at least 2 meetings, possibly 3. Tom.
All right, good morning, and again, welcome back. Yeah, you all have had a pretty long morning so far. We'll add a couple more hours to it, but just wanted to provide an overview of where we're at, kind of the broad general overview of the budget, how we attack it here in the county. The process started earlier this year, probably even last year, certainly with departments looking at their long-range plans, taking into account their needs and their operational requirements for the forthcoming years. You've heard from Susan and the auditor's office several times over the last several months on the state of our current fiscal matters. We're in very good shape right now. So what we want to do over the course of the next several meetings here, and really the next couple months, is frame a proposed budget for you. But of course, as the commission, you do have the statutory authority and the responsibility to determine what that budget looks like. So up in front of you is the FY25 budget timeline. It really, in terms of putting products together, it began earlier this year. You've heard from all of our departments, our outside departments. Also at the end of last year, you heard from outside agencies on their progress. So a lot of work has already been done to date. By mid-May, we had all of our budget material. It was made available to you, the commissioners. I know you've had a chance to look at it, but we'll dive certainly deeper into it over the coming days, coming meetings. Where we're at right now certainly is June, so this is the start of our budget meetings. Today's the first of 3 scheduled ones, if they're all needed. What I do want to point out, I'm just moving the mouse here. Importantly is today, provide you with, it lays the groundwork in terms of what our finances are, kind of how human resources are looking, but also tees up requests from departments, but also gives you a chance to discuss and provide some direction to staff on what you perhaps want to see at the next meeting. And then, of course, next Tuesday, meet again, and if needed, January 25th. Now, we get started with these budget meetings in early June, because really one of our key target dates is July 2nd. That's the last scheduled meeting prior to July 15th, which is the deadline for a commission to consider an opt-out. Not suggesting that you are or aren't going to pass an opt-out, but wanted to throw it out there as really one of our key time drivers here. July is a busy month, so during that time period, possibly looking at an opt-out, but also July 16th is our target date to present what amounts to what we call the provisional budget. No action required on your part, but it'll be the kind of the final package budget that will go to a public hearing in September. So the action on July 16th will be simply to pass a motion to file the provisional budget with the auditor, so it could be published in the newspaper. We'll certainly look forward to September as those hearings start, and then the commission actually considers approval of the budget. Other items that are interspersed in here, the end of August at a joint meeting with the city of Sioux Falls, look at various joint budgets to include the museum, library, and metro. And then, as I mentioned, September, ideally wrapping things up with the budget. So today in particular, I mentioned earlier, you'll get a great overview of finances from the auditor's office, and then we'll move into human resources. Somewhat of a different twist from previous agendas. After we take a look at human resources, we'll look at other requests. These are generally personnel requests, vehicle and equipment requests, but also outside agency requests. And then we'll follow that with a broader overview of our cash flow analysis, cash flow projections, look at the highway fund, and then really turn it back over to you for discussion on those items that have been presented to you. The goal for today is to receive, as staff, some guidance from the commission, particularly on any additional department presentations you'd want to see next week or at a future meeting. Any other outside agency presentations, more information that you want directly from the requesters, and then certainly any other items that you want us to tee up for discussion, say next week, the week after, or even a following week. So again, the next budget meetings are going to be June 18th, next Tuesday, and we also have one scheduled for the 25th. So with that, if you don't have any questions just about the process, I will turn it over to the auditor's office to provide an overview of our current financial situation.
Oh, you already went over our time, so, no.
Good morning, Susan Beeman with the Auditor's Office. To start with today, we're going to just go through some of our April financial results. You may be wondering why we're not presenting May. That's because they just got finalized yesterday. So graphs and things like that are still being prepared. These are graphs that are part of your normal monthly, on the normal monthly consent agenda under reports. So as we go forward throughout the summer, if you have questions on any of those, certainly reach out to us, or we could do an additional briefing down the road if necessary. So to start with, we just wanted to do an overview of general fund cash reserves. So you'll notice for 2024 is the green line at the top. You'll see a big jump in April of 2024, and that is pretty consistent. We always see a big jump in our cash reserves in April as well as October, because those are when the semi-annual property tax payments come in. You'll notice that that number is quite a bit higher than prior year. Part of why that is we ended last year with pretty strong 2023 financial results. Our revenue was higher than budgeted, and our expenses were lower than budgeted, and that translates into additional cash reserves for the county. Currently, as you get into 2024, you'll see that those same numbers are, the same trends are pretty consistent. It's just a little bit higher than prior year. As we go into highway fund, fairly consistent with prior year as well. 11.2 for prior year cash, 10.9 for the highway fund for 2024. Again, they do also have some peaks and their valleys of their cash flow. They do their big construction projects throughout the summer. They pay those out towards the fall and as they get to the end of the year. So you always see that decline in cash at the end of the year. We will be diving into the highway fund specifically towards the end of today, so we'll have a little bit more conversation on that as we go forward. Any questions on cash so far? Okay. When we get into total general fund revenue, revenue generally remains on track. 2024 collections are a little bit ahead of prior year. So when we get into the details of the next two slides, that breaks this down in between property taxes as well as other. So we'll go to those slides next. So with property taxes, we are on track for 2024. You'll see a big jump in property tax current revenue received in April. Again, that's consistent with taxes being paid for May 1st deadline. We did receive an additional $3.8 million in May for current year property tax payments. Some people miss that May 1st deadline and they pay a little bit late in May. Generally speaking, the county receives about 99% of the property taxes in the year that they're due. So there's that 1% that carries over as a delinquent tax the next year. But generally on track with where we've been. Sliding into other revenues, again, we're on track with prior year as well as budget. A couple of areas that we're trending a little bit ahead of budget. One is board of prisoner revenue is a little higher than anticipated, just with how the jail has been able to maintain its county census. We've been able to do a few more bed rentals, so that brings in revenue for the county. Additionally, interest income remains very strong. With rates still above 5% in many places, that brings in additional revenue for us that we're over than what we budgeted. Okay. Moving on into total expenditures. Again, our expenses are generally on track. We're a little bit slower than budget. Budget is about 33%. You can see our expenses totally are about 30%, so just slightly below on a spend for expenses. When we break it down into personnel, Again, we're at that 30% mark for personnel expenses year-to-date of budget. 33% is 4 months of the year. So again, slightly behind, meaning we're underspent. We're underspending our budget so far. So when we get into the other expenses, again, we're still trending in that 30% of budget for other expenses. Overall, the expenses for non-personnel related items are generally trending on budget. There are a few areas that are potentially trending over budget for the year. One that comes to mind is our courts, and as the courts have presented to you in a prior session when they gave their briefing, just the increase in court-appointed attorneys and psych evals and interpreters, those are trending out slightly ahead of budget for a 4-month time period. We'll just pause there before we move into the next section to see if you have any question on our current financials. I went through that fairly quickly, but I know you receive these monthly, so I didn't want to dive too deep.
Questions?
Mr. Chair, just one quick baseline question. Can you just speak to, when we talk about our general fund cash reserves, we have advice from bond rating agencies, and we want to keep, is it 20 or 25% in reserves? And it starts to get into the cash applied analysis and whatnot, but could you maybe just give the 1-minute overview of that to set the stage for cash reserves?
State law, STCL says that we cannot have more than 40% of unassigned fund balance in our general fund, 40% of next year's appropriations in our general fund. They actually don't have a lower limit, so technically 2%, we're still in compliance with law. We would never want to get down to a 2% unassigned fund balance. In our last bond rating with Moody's, they indicated that if we dip that unassigned fund balance below 20%, they would see that as unfavorable and could trigger a downgrade in our rating. So that's something we want to keep aware of. Not that we have any immediate plans for another bond issue, but it's something that we want to make sure that we keep an eye on. We've talked within the auditor's office and the commission office that, a 25% level is probably a good baseline. We don't technically have a policy on that, so that's just maybe a guideline at this point. We certainly could look at bringing a more formal policy forward, but that's kind of what, when we get into the forecast, that's that 25% benchmark is what I've used.
That's helpful for now. Thank you.
What is our Moody's rating?
Oh, I don't have that off the top of my
okay,
head.
that's fine.
It's a good, strong rating.
It's in the top 2 or 3?
AA.
Okay. Okay.
And if we were to have a downgrade, that means our interest rates and things would end up costing us more. Okay. So next topic would be a summary of our existing opt-outs. We like to start our budget conversation with this in mind, just so that you know where we are sitting with opt-outs, as well as we get into the requests where we know we have capacity. So first, we do have 2 opt-outs in the building fund that total $1,410,000. Just wanted to note out that the opt-out for the Human Services building of a $260,000 annual opt-out, 2025 is the last year that opt-out will be in place. That opt-out was to pay for the debt that was issued to do some improvements at that building. That debt is paid off in 2025, so in 26 the revenue goes away, but the expense goes away. So it'll be a net impact of 0 to the building fund. In the general fund, we have currently $17,625,000 in total general fund opt-outs that have been approved. Currently, we are levying just over $15.5 million in opt-out in the general fund. So we have $622,000 left in capacity on the 2019 opt-out, with $1.5 million that has not been used on the opt-out that was passed for 2023. So total opt-out available to be levied is $2,122,000. I will also call out for you to see this $1,625,000. That opt-out was passed in 2006. That expires. We can levy that through 2026, but in 2027 that will drop off. So that's something as we get into the forecast, we will be looking at what that impact is.
Okay.
Any questions on this before we move forward? Okay. So when we get into general fund revenues, we'll dive into each of these categories as we go forward, but this gives us a very broad overview of the different areas on a total revenue perspective. So our 2025 budget has total revenues of $84.9 million in the general fund. 2024 budget had an $80.4 million, so about a $4.9 million increase. 2023 actual was $82.4 million. Do want to call out 2022 as well as 2023. You see some pretty big spikes in those numbers. Those are COVID relief dollars in 2022, as well as ARPA and South Dakota CARES in 2022. That had some pretty big jumps. So, and we'll see that more specifically as we get into the different areas. The first section that we're going to dive into is property taxes. This slide, the blue bar is the levy that we're allowed to take by state law with growth in CPI, and then the red bars are the opt-out. And then we have a small amount of back taxes and interest that comes together to bring us our taxes, total taxes that are the blue line as you go forward. And you can tell that the last few years we've had higher increase in taxes, and that tax value has gone up to a little over $62 million for 2025 budget. And you can see this a little bit more specifically in numbers when you get to this slide. Has a lot of numbers on it, but I'll break it down for you in the sense that this first line, the $46 million, we go to the far right for 2025 budget. That is the amount that we are able to assess. That's our amount without opt-out. $15.5 million is our opt-out with back taxes of $635,000, totals of $62.2 million. So roughly 25% of our total tax revenue is related to opt-out. For 2025 budget, our CPI that we're allowed to assess is 3%. So that will, part of our increase in total revenue for property taxes is $1.3 million related to CPI. And growth this year is 3.36%, and will be about $1.4 million. So total property tax increase for growth in CPI is $2.7 million. And when we talk about growth, I just want to remind you that's construction growth. That's not market value changes. So it's just that new construction within the county.
Mr. Chair, one clarification. So that 2.7 million there, that's the CPI and growth. That's embedded in the top line number there, 46.
Correct.
So that you're just pulling that out
Yeah,
for
I'm just pointing out how you
illustrative
get to
purposes.
that. Yeah.
We don't add that to the 46.
Correct.
It's already in there.
It's
Okay.
already in there, yes.
Thank you.
Yep. And we did include on this slide the last few years of total increases. So you can see in 2022, growth in CPI was 3.81%. 23 was 6.2%. 24 was 6.9%. And 6.3% for 2025. For 23 through 25, though, each of those years we reached that cap of 3% on CPI. And we'll dive into the cap in a few slides. Any questions on this before I move forward? Okay. So as we get into the conversation on the cap, you've seen this slide previously, but we like to remind everyone about it because that cap on CPI, when years that inflation exceed 3%, does have a lasting impact on our property taxes. For 2023, actual CPI was 5.3, but we had a cap of 3%. For 2024, actual is 8.5. We had a cap of 3% that we were allowed to include in property taxes. And this year it's 3.8 was actual with the cap of 3%. So we're allowed to only assess the lesser of actual or 3%. So for these years where we've exceeded 3%, we are capped at 3%. So what does that mean in the form of property taxes? So what that means is For 2025, the impact on our property taxes, if we would have been allowed to charge actual CPI in our property tax formula, our property tax revenue amount would be $5.1 million higher. And so because that base then rolls forward each year, that number is not in the base each year as you go forward. So it has a compounding and lasting impact on our property tax revenue. We do have the ability to opt out to help balance that out, but opt-outs do not increase with growth or CPI. So those opt-outs stay the same, but expenses that keep inflating, and then we get to that deviation. For example, just so you can understand how that happens, and I won't go through all of these slides, but you can see all of these numbers in detail. This is just an example of 2024 when we had that 8.5% CPI, how that 4.4 million that you saw in the previous slide, how it's calculated. The original base taxes were $1.8 million short from prior years. And then with growth and CPI not being at the correct amount or at the actual amount using the bases, that's where you get to that 4.4 million. And then that just rolls forward from here on out. Okay. Any questions with any of this so far? Keeping on the property tax conversation, we wanted to show you some estimated property tax levies. This is just the property taxes that are for county services, does not include cities or schools or fire protection areas. This is just general fund, building fund, and bond redemption. So the property tax numbers here, totaling $74.6 million, is the number that you will have in your means of finance as we continue to move forward. The preliminary abstract value of $25.1 billion is the current estimated abstract value for that it will be in effect. I do want to call out that that is subject to change. It has not been approved by the state. That's preliminary numbers only. For comparison, prior year abstract value was $23.6 billion, so about a $1.5 billion increase in abstract values. So when we get into the actual levy calculation, the levy for those three funds is a slight decrease from 2024 down to 2.973. And I should also make a note that this includes for general fund no additional opt-out. This is just using opt-outs at 2024 levels.
Susan, thank you for presenting this slide because we talk about what's the impact on a $300,000 house. Well, nobody's house stays $300,000, so we built in the increase that the appraised went from 300 to 327 to show the true impact of what our budget is doing here, so that we're not being disingenuous or not being fully transparent on our budget.
Correct. So you might remember in prior years we've left at 300,000 in both columns. This year what we did for 2025 is the average increase that percentage that I received from equalization was about a 9.3% increase. So we've taken that $300,000 home, increased it by 9.3% to get $327,900. So roughly speaking, your property taxes for county services would go up $64.05 with this levy.
And if we had left the value at 300,000,
they'd be a decrease.
A decrease, yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
And some areas, homes will go up higher than 9.3. It just depends upon those market evaluations that equalization does. But this is meant to just kind of show what an average would look like with the increase in the levies for property taxes and other types of revenue, and the abstract value is what it would look like.
Yep, thank you.
And just to maybe remind everyone that the county services is only part of the property tax formula. If you were to live in Sioux Falls, in the city of Sioux Falls School District, this portion of your levy equates to about 21%. The remaining is city, schools, et cetera. So I just want to, and that 21% is going to be different for different people. If you live in a township versus in a city, that will be different. But generally speaking, about 21% if you were in Sioux Falls.
And I think we have 13 school districts in Minnehaha County.
I don't have that off the top of my head either.
I think that's about what it is.
And a question on this, can you clarify what is included in this? I know we're probably gonna go through some iterations of this. Like, does this include new FTE requests or some of the other increases that we might be considering? Or what's our baseline when we're talking about this chart?
This chart is going to be just your property tax revenue and to calculate your levy. So this is purely on revenue. So if the commission decides that we need opt-outs to balance the budget and we need to increase our revenue above what's in the current means of finance, then that would increase your general fund property tax revenue, and then that would thus increase your levy. So the expenses per se don't have a direct correlation to this. It's part of the overall budget. This is just really taking your property tax revenue to your abstract values.
Okay, I think I follow you, but yeah, we'll come back to that concept, I'm sure.
This is a slide that we have not included in the past. We wanted to just show some historical property tax levies. There's always that question of how market values and growth change levies and such. And so this is our historical property tax levies from 2018 through 2024 with preliminary 2025 on there. You can see, generally speaking, from 2018 to 2025, those levies have continually decreased as we have gone forward with additional market value changes as the levies have gone down. There's a few little areas where they haven't, specifically general fund in 2020, that we had an increase in opt-out that year for a new opt-out that was passed. And then specifically when you get into the bond redemption fund in 2020 and 2021, those are the debt service coverage for the jail bonds that were issued in late 2017. And then again in 2024 and 25, that's the JJC bond. But generally speaking, from 2018 to 2025, those levies have gone down. Okay. As we move forward into the other areas within our revenue budget, the first one we wanted to cover is charges for goods and services. From 2020 through 2025, you can see we've had an increase now up to $13.5 million for 2025 budget. Things are generally consistent from year to year with some slight changes from here within a few areas. Currently speaking, the jail board of prisoner revenue, again, is still trending favorable this year and is up slightly in the 2025 budget as well. As our Register of Deeds has indicated, her fees in that office are down. That kind of trends inverse to the interest rate market. So interest rates are up. They're not seeing a lot of refinancings and things like that. So their revenue have been lower. Where back in 2021 and 2022, their revenue was 3.3 million. 2025 budget has a $2.4 million reflection, and that's fairly consistent with her 23 results as well as her trending for 24. And then additionally speaking, JDC fees are higher than prior year as we look to open that building. The formula for that bed rate includes a portion for depreciation and how we've agreed on that formula. Any questions as we move forward into the next slide?
Can I ask a question about that one? Do all of those charges end up, or do we have any idea if any of those charges end up in liens, or are they paid? And what percentage or?
So looking at the fees, the liens per se on court fees and things like that and human services, they might be repaying. These are expenses that have been potentially repaid. So these itself wouldn't be a reflective of a lien. The expenses would be what could generate a lien. Does that make sense? So this is revenue coming into the county for maybe repaying of a lien.
Okay, so it's not just charges, it's paid charges.
These are things, revenue that we have gotten in. So these could be people paying on a past poor relief service that they had received. It could be somebody that had court-appointed attorney that they're paying their services.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Intergovernmental revenues are next slide. And as you can see, this has a little ups and downs, again, correlating to timing of COVID relief funds as well as ARPA. As we go forward, you'll see this number trending down. And you can see we had 13.3 million in COVID dollars in 2020. We had between ARPA and South Dakota CARES just over $16 million there. And then in 2023, that was down to 3.5 million. So that number will continue to decline. And as we have talked frequently, the majority of the ARPA dollars will be recognized in 2024. There will be very little left for 25. So we won't see much impact in the 2025 budget for ARPA at all. Any questions on any of these categories? I won't go into things too detailed. Most of it is fairly consistent from year to year. Okay. The miscellaneous revenue, the biggest things here are, again, the interest income that we've spoke about. So you can see that big jump in 2023 for actual increases in 22. We expect 2024 will still be considerably higher than budget as well, just because the rates are still a lot higher. We have increased our budget for 2025 for interest income, but we didn't want to go too high because we know that it eventually will be coming down. So right now we have a budget of 1.2 million for interest income. That probably is conservative, but without having a crystal ball on interest rates, we don't want to go too high.
What interest rate are you using as an assumption in when you build that number?
We're mostly looking at our history here. So if you look at 2022, our actual revenue that we had for interest income was just under $1 million. Then 2023, it jumped up to 3.2 million. So we started to see some of that interest income pop up in 2022. As we spend some of our cash reserves as well, that will go down. As ARPA gets spent, that will go down.
Yeah, obviously
So
there's two variables. There's the rate itself and then just the
cash.
quantity of cash we have
Correct.
sitting there. So yeah, we had to keep both those things in mind. But okay, thank you.
And we also know as we go forward that we'll have ongoing budget needs to address. So if we were to bring that up to, let's say, 3 million, next year we'd drop it down 1 million. Next year we would have to drop it down 1 million. So we're just trying to be somewhat consistent with our interest income, but also be reflective of the market, but not go too high. The additional one that's new this year is opioid settlements. We have been getting opioid settlements for the last couple of years. It's been fairly slow. So we received 63,000 in 2022 and 90,000 in 2023. We have so far received 530,000 in 2024, with notification of additional 200,000 coming in 2024 that we have not yet received. So that'll bring it just over 700,000. So we do know that some of the 2024 money was delayed due to the fact there was some disputes from other counties that delayed the money coming to us. So we did bring a revenue in for opioid settlements about 300,000 into the budget. So that is something new this year.
How many years out are those opioid settlements projected for, Susan?
I believe it's 18.
18, okay.
But what we don't know is how much and when.
Gotcha, thank you.
So we feel pretty comfortable with the current volume, that 300,000 is reasonable. but we don't have a lot of historical data, and would I want to say that we should expect that for the next 10 to 15 years, that same level? I would not feel comfortable at this point doing that.
Okay. Okay.
And Susan, can you tell me about the private grants for the budget?
Certainly. The $218,000 in the 2024 budget is related to MacArthur, the SJC grant. And so as we don't currently have an active grant with them or a private grant that we are anticipating getting revenue in 25, that's why that private grant line is 0. If down the road we were to have a private grant that we got approved, that would have a budget impact, we could certainly look at changing that. But at this point, nothing is signed, so that's why that revenue is 0.
Limited to MacArthur?
That the $218,000 from the prior year is just MacArthur.
Okay.
Fines and forfeits, this slide is pretty consistent. We don't see a lot of changes. That's a $230,000 budget for 2025, comparative to a budget from prior year of $244,500. So again, fairly consistent from year to year there. For licenses and permits, you will see a couple of changes on this slide. You'll notice for 23 a big jump. That's primarily a building permit due to a larger school permit in 2023. That's kind of an anomaly. So you'll notice that for 24 and 25 budgets, you're kind of back to more of a historical budget because that's not a normal revenue source for us for that type of permit. As well as for, I just wanted to call out that we did remove any budget for cannabis license revenue, as we've currently don't have an active license. We removed that revenue from the budget at this time. If we were to have a medical cannabis license issued, we could go back and reevaluate that. That was a $30,000 annual license. Okay. As we move into the expenditure side of things, this has a lot of bars and a lot of numbers on it. But as you can see, again, the consistent trend of expenses continuing to jump in those years of higher inflation. Our total expense for general fund budget is just over $88.6 million, comparative to $86.5 million for 2024. We talk about public safety being about 70% of our general fund budget. When you add up the public safety line here, the legal services and the judicial system, those equal 70.5% of our 2025 budget for general fund. So we're still consistently at about 70% of our general fund is related to public safety. Any questions on this slide before we move forward? Diving into the general fund request, and we'll get into the means of finance a little bit later so you can see the overall. We wanted to show you the 25 revenue and expenses compared to the 24 revenue and expenses. So our revenue is about $4.5 million higher, and expenses are about $2.1 million higher than the prior year. So as we get into this, please keep in mind that opt-out is budgeted at 2024 amounts. We have not increased it. A 3% matrix adjustment is included. An 8% insurance increase is included for employee insurance. All new position requests are excluded. Outside agency donations are budgeted at 2024 amounts, and equipment requests are included. So diving into the revenue section specifically, that $4.5 million, I've identified just the higher level items that make up that $4.5 million increase. Again, 2.7 of that is your property tax revenue. 600,000 is investment income. A $450,000 increase to board of prisoner revenue. And then juvenile detention and shelter care housing is about a $439,000 increase. Opioid settlements is a $300,000 increase. Register of deeds is a $190,000 decrease. removal of the private grants from MacArthur is $218,000. And then generally all of the other pluses and minuses under 100,000 make up that $385,000 increase. Any questions on that before we move forward?
I guess one thought comes to my mind. We look at the investment income and the relationship of that to the Register of Deeds decrease, because the decrease in the Register of Deeds is because interest rates are too high.
Correct.
And if we have interest rates high, our investment income should stay up while our Register of Deeds revenue stays low. But if one changes, the other one, and we're lowering one and kind of lowering the other, aren't we taking two bites of the apple there?
We've talked a lot about that. We feel that interest income for 25 will probably be higher than the 1.2 million we have in there. And so we wanted to increase it some, but we didn't want to go the whole big jump, just because we know eventually we're going to have to drop it down. And especially as we use cash over the next few years, that will decrease and we'll have to make that up. So we would look for feedback from the commission. If you feel comfortable with us increasing it, we certainly can.
Okay. No, it's something to keep in mind as we're balancing the budget for sure.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving into the expense section for general fund. This is personnel, salaries and benefits. The 3% matrix is roughly a $1.3 million increase of the 1.7. Salaries, step increase and other position changes. So that can be, the other position changes could be somebody that was at a step 12 in their pay grade retired and the person came in at a step 1. So again, that would be a decrease in budget. So there's a lot of different things that go into that $572,000. Benefits related to matrix and step, $241,000 increase. And the health insurance increase at 8% with other employee election. You'll wonder why we have an increase of 8%, but we're reflecting a $71,000 decrease in the expense. Part of that is when we did the 24 budget, we included a 10% increase for employee insurance, and it actually turned out to be about a 3% increase. So that 24 budget, we ended up not utilizing all of that for as part of the 24 actual increase to employees. So some of that is part of that. And then the rest of it is just employee election changes. Again, a person left and they had family coverage, they were rehired with somebody that was maybe single coverage, and that results in a savings to the department. And then additionally speaking, elections, because it's not an election year next year, we see a decrease in election staff that we hire and overtime, so that's a $168,000 decrease. Okay. For non-personnel related expenses, we have an increase of $415,000. Many of these things that are on this list you have seen come before you in the form of briefings or new contracts and things like that have come up. So the courts are requesting a $280,000 increase. That was discussed in detail when the courts did their briefing to you of where those needs are. A fairly standard or reoccurring item is just an increase in jail medical expenses for the jail. That's $233,000. County insurance for all departments within the general fund is a little over a $200,000 increase. IT is requesting a $192,000 increase. That is related to Microsoft 365 rollout. Juvenile alternatives, shelter care is a $150,000 request. The mental illness for hospital of $144,000. That is the change from using ARPA dollars to general fund dollars to fund that contract for the medical screenings for first day of a mental health hold, for the involuntary mental health holds. The IT data processing equipment of $125,000 is just to start that process for a new phone system. And then the sheriff's office is requesting $106,000 for professional services, with the majority of that related to some transitional housing for Southeastern Behavioral. And then as we've talked about the MacArthur SJC grant, the revenue not being reflected, we also don't have the expenses reflected because those there is no active grant for 2025. And then additionally, with it not being an election year, we don't have election-related expenses of over 600,000. So I'll just pause there to see if you have any questions.
Stuck. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking to Tom.
Okay. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll move on. So as we move into the means of finance,
Thank you.
today we're just showing you the first four funds, which with deeper dives on general fund and highway fund. We'll do a next week on the 18th, we'll dive into the building fund and the debt service. We felt if we focus on general fund and general fund and highway today, that was probably sufficient. So as we talk through all of the detailed dollars that we discussed in previous slides, this is what the means of finance looks like. So general fund revenue of $84.9 million for general fund, $17.1 million for highway. And like I said, we will go have a deeper dive on highway later today. And then for general fund, you'll notice that less 5% of appropriations per SDCL, we are required to calculate a 5% of appropriation as a holdback. So that brings our net means of finance to 80.5 million, with appropriations of 88.6 million, interfund transfer mainly to the emergency management fund of 326,000. That brings our total 2024 appropriations to just over $89 million. That shows cash applied for the general fund of 8.5 million, and highway fund will be about 2.5 million, which we'll dive into deeper. Again, this includes all of things that we have previously discussed, but this shows you in the means of finance view what we are looking at.
Susan, I don't know if this is the right place to ask this question, but I noticed on one of the prior screens, one or two back, is it okay, or is it permissible to pay for our building insurance from our building fund? Are we taking that from our general fund at this time?
The majority of our property insurance is covered out of the general fund. Mm-hmm. We could dive into the statute a little bit on the building fund as far as if that would be allowed. Mm-hmm. Generally, off the top of my head, it's to construct and maintain a building or county building. So I probably would need to do some investigation if insurance coverage for a county building would be allowed. But generally speaking, it's in the general fund, or it would be the highway fund for highway buildings.
Because we separate our building insurance from our liability insurance. So if you would look into that.
You certainly can.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a position or two, if nothing else, but yeah.
So before we move on to the next section, I'll just pause. The next section will transition into human resources. We will be diving into cash applied illustration, cash applied rates after Carrie's portion of the briefing. So just pause there before we go forward if there's anything that I've covered thus far that you have questions on.
Let me try again to see if my question is now ripe, because I think I asked it just at the property tax revenue level, but at this is where you've got different assumptions, like if we approve no new positions and outside agency donations at 2024 amounts. So in theory, I presume we're going to approve some of those things. So this would then change, and we'd iterate on this chart to give us the sense of an impact of those decisions, that if we approve certain FTEs and certain equipment, these numbers would change then.
Right. So as we move forward throughout the day, we'll talk about forecasts. We'll talk about if you were to approve all positions, what that would do to a cash applied rate.
Okay.
And what that cash applied rate really is the county has historically used 8% as our target for cash applied, and that really is representative of that 5% holdback here of the 4.4 million, and roughly 3% of underspending on expenses is where that 8% has historically come from. Like last year, our revenue was higher than budget and our expenses came in under budget, so we kind of came out good on both sides. So that's where, as commission, as we look at that cash applied rate, which is roughly a 9.6% cash applied rate, are you comfortable earmarking that as reserves, using some of those extra dollars we brought in last year to help fund that? Are you looking at potentially other revenue sources, potentially interest income and changing it, or cutting expenses somewhere else? Those are the pieces that we would have to look at, or potentially opt out. Those would
Yeah,
be pieces of that puzzle.
I was just going to follow up. So as we approve potentially new positions, equipment, outside agency donations, that goes up, we have at least a couple options there. We could do more cash applied or some combination of, we can also levy further into our opt-outs. So,
Good.
so some combination of those things. So I'm just making sure I know what all options are on the table as, but somehow this chart will change to accommodate and make the numbers add up in the end.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. I think we'll move into Carrie's section.
Okay, we're going to try and give you a sense of some of the numbers that Susan has presented. We put in, as Susan mentioned, a 3% for matrix adjustment, 8% for insurance adjustment. Hopefully the next slides will give you some context for that so we can get some direction on whether or not you want to make any adjustments to that. Okay, 1 second.
I was just using the mouse, Carrie.
You were? Oh, there we go. Thanks. Okay. We've talked a lot about staff turnover the past couple of years, especially as we've had that rate increase. This is just to give you a sense of where we're at currently. You heard about this, of course, earlier the year. Good news to report, it's come down to 16%. I love to see that 2%. It might seem like a small number, but that equates to a lot of staff and then a lot of dollars in savings and turnover costs. Of course, the flip of that is we're still 3% higher than we have been historically. And if you go back further than 2019, those rates were even lower. So something we want to keep an eye on and be aware of. Other things that you focus on when you're looking at what type of adjustment do you want to make to the pay matrix are consumer price index, the cost of labor. This chart is intended to give you a bird's eye view of what those changes have been and these other sources over the past few years. So as you look at this, you can see that national CPI, we had those high levels in 2022. They've come down. That 3.3% is the average so far of 2024. Midwest CPI, you can see, is very close to that at 2.8 right now. One thing I like to include in there is the South Dakota state minimum wage adjustments. As they adjust the minimum wage for the state, of course, that has an impact on some of our lower paid staff, so we want to keep in mind what adjustments they're making there too. You can see coming into 2024 that they adjusted at that 3.7%. ECI is the employment cost index, very similar to CPI, except it's measuring employment cost itself. Those tend to trend just a little bit higher. This is that same data, just in a different view. Again, these are highlighted in blue for you because I want you to be aware that that's only for 2024 data. So if we're looking at 2025, you're probably wondering, why aren't we talking about 2025 numbers? And it's, of course, because we don't really have those yet. But we do look at other governmental salary structure increases or what they're doing for their matrix. Again, I wish I could give you what they're all doing, but they're in very similar processes we are right now. I can tell you that those that have contractual obligations that I know from some of our comparable entities, they're ranging anywhere from a 2.5 to a 5% adjustment for 2025. We know, of course, that the state is doing their 2025 adjustment on July 1st, and I believe that's a 4%. This gives you some historical context for what we've adjusted our pay rates. We've got the 3% in our budget figures for you right now for our matrix for 2025. I think that's in line with some of these rates that we're looking at. The other thing that I would say we should take into consideration here is, of course, we're in the process of getting the beginning stages of our comp study. So it might be wise at this point to hold steady with the 3% and then see where we come out with the comp study early next year as we budget for 2026. Any questions on the matrix adjustment side? Okay. All right. Our other staff that we want you to consider as we're setting budget is our elected officials. This, of course, includes all of our elected department heads and you as commissioners. One thing that we like to give you to take into consideration as you're setting 2025 budget is where people are standing right now in 2024 in comparison to some of our comparable organizations. Every time you see this, I caution you that this data tends to fluctuate quite a bit and can depend on the people who are in office and what they're doing. But this gives you some sense of what our comparable organizations are paying for these roles. If you're looking down here and you're seeing a lot of NAs, the reason for that is when we go out to our comparable organizations, the state's attorneys, some of them do have a salary range where they have a base salary and a max salary. Some of them do not. So for the auditor, treasurer, and register of deeds, none of our comparable organizations have a salary range for those positions. Same thing with the commission. You can see that people are paying a flat rate. And just a quick note that the commission chair salary is slightly higher than that to recognize those additional responsibilities that come with being a chair. As a recap, for the last couple of years, you've put in a placeholder instead of deciding actual salaries. You've put a placeholder into the budget, and you've been making determinations later in the year, closer to November, December, about what actual salaries will be for 2025. So we'll be looking for direction on that as well. For health and dental insurance premiums, over the years, I've provided you with different data, trying to give you a sense of really where we should be budgeting. The bottom line is that there's really no good way to tell you right now what our costs are going to be through the end of this year and then projecting into 2025. We put in an 8% for next year, and that's for a few reasons. First, that's close to medical trend. Secondly, if you look past the past 5 to 6 years of what our historical increase have actually been to premiums, they've been averaging around 8%. And if that seems high, it's just because we had a couple years there where our costs went up pretty significantly. The good news is that so far this year, we're trending below what I would have expected us to do. So I'm hoping that when I come back with premium recommendations in November, that figure will be less than 8%. But at this point in the time, we'd rather take a conservative approach and make sure there's enough in the budget to cover costs. Any questions on the insurance side? One last thing to do with salary and benefits that we wanted to talk about is retention bonuses. You probably remember this is a program that was implemented in 2022 as a temporary program only, intended hopefully to reduce the turnover rates in some of our key law enforcement positions. This provides a bonus to anybody who stays at 9-month intervals for up to the first 3 years of employment. So basically 4 $1,000 bonuses that they're eligible for. Right now in the 2025 budget, the only portion that is included is the part that's been obligated for people who would be hired through the end of this year, since it's a temporary program that it now ends at the end of 2024. So the part that isn't included for the 2025 budget is if we were to hire somebody in January, for example, and they reach their 9-month anniversary, that portion isn't included. And that's about $25,000, we would estimate. The annualized cost of this program has varied slightly, of course, depending on what those turnover rates are, but in 2023, it was around $118,000. I realize that's a significant cost. On the flip side, it's a small portion of our payroll overall. And as we look at, is this program paying off, I would say the cost of just ensuring turnover went down by just 6 people in a correctional officer role, for example. Each person has a savings of at least $21,000 in turnover costs. So I think it's a program that pays for itself relatively quickly. I've spoken with Jamie Gravitt and Mike Mattson and Jeff Gromer about this program. I think we all realize there's value in the program, and or also that many of our competitors are offering similar programs. So one other item we'll be looking for direction from you is if you're comfortable for us budgeting it not only for 2025, but to anticipate the program would continue.
One question I'd have on that is, Carrie, you mentioned, on your first slide, I think that we went from an 18% staff turnover to 16%, but that would be county employment wide.
That's correct.
Do you have any sense for in those areas where we've put this incentive structure in, has there been some causation there? Do you think it has, or at least a correlation, or do we see good impact? Are those areas also seeing that decrease?
I can tell you that they've had a lower turnover in both those areas as well, which is good news. Can I say that this is directly tied to the retention bonus? I would love to, and we've tried to look at this at when are people leaving? Are they leaving right after they've received their retention bonus, or is it some point in between? And for example, if you say, well, they left the month after they received the retention bonus, does that mean it worked because we got them to stay, or does it mean it didn't work because they left? I think the downward trend in turnover rates is the most important. And again, while that $120,000 annualized cost, we realize there is a cost to that program, we think it pays for itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what I'm looking for at some point, we can do that as under requests or considerations, or I don't know if you have thoughts right now on what you would like to do for elected officials, if you want to follow what we have done for the past couple of years and put in a placeholder about the matrix adjustment, or where maybe you feel.
So to lay the groundwork, 3% is 2.5% is our average matrix adjustment, and 3% is what is contractually we have for most of our employees, correct?
3% is what's contractually obligated for next year for the union, and what we put in for the matrix adjustment overall. And it's that percentage that you've mirrored over the past couple of years
So we're
for
looking
elected officials.
somewhere between 3 and 5% probably. Is that kind of what you're?
At the end of the year, we talk about that whatever we've done for matrix adjustment versus what type of salary adjustments everybody is eligible for. And so I think you're thinking about the step increase, and that is something the commission has taken in consideration at the end of the year when they're actually determining the salary for the upcoming year. At this point in the past few years, what the commission has done is just budgeted in a placeholder that's equivalent to the matrix adjustment alone,
Which is 2.5.
which is 3 for next
3,
year. Yeah.
okay.
You, of course, can take a different approach. The nice thing with those departments is usually their budgets can absorb a little bit more if you do more than the matrix adjustment when you're actually setting salaries for elected officials.
Commissioner Bender?
I would be in favor of doing that. I think that that's worked well for us the last few years. Gives us time to get through this budget process.
I concur.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Okay. All right, we can do that. And do you have thoughts this early on retention bonuses, or would you rather come back to that on whether or not you're comfortable budgeting for that in the future?
Is it baked into the budget that Susan presented? Are those retention bonuses already?
The run out of the bonuses that were agreed on in '24 and prior are budgeted for '25.
So they're already in the numbers that we saw?
Yes, it's just if you were to extend the program into '25,
That would impact 6.
well, '25 potentially would impact fourth quarter, because anybody hired in the first quarter would be getting a payout for their first bonus in 2020.
Oh, I see. So it'd be the $25,000 is all we're talking about?
Correct.
Okay.
And just to remind you, the retention bonuses have been ARPA funded through 2024. So that's where this is a shift into the general fund for the first time.
Thoughts from the commission? Commissioner Bender?
Well, I'm not comfortable removing the retention benefits, so I think that means I'm in favor of going ahead and budgeting particularly.
Yeah, I think so too. Also, I would strategically put it into the vision of we'll be looking at all job, what the market is for all positions and the wage analysis. So I would kind of say stay the course of what our strategies are now. If we get feedback from that, the market assessment and things that we need to structurally reform how we, the pay ranges for certain positions, then I think next year is the time to pivot strategically. So I would say keep the status quo of the program. So I'd be in favor of keeping the retention program, but we could relook at all classifications and everything in the next year when we have more data. But yeah, I think it might be premature to just cut off the program right now without more data. So I'd be in favor of at least extending it one more year, which I know has a tail effect for years 2 and 3. But yeah.
I don't see anybody shaking their heads, so I would agree.
All right,
Yep.
thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
All right, Carrie's not going to go too far. So we'll move into discussing some of the requests from the departments and outside agencies. So we'll cover staffing.
I was going to say, we're 10 minutes ahead right now. Can we maybe take a quick break and eliminate the break at 1:30?
Yep.
Okay. Why don't we take 10 minutes right now? Okay. With, actually, we're only off by a few minutes, even with that break, so we're good.
All right, Tom Greco again. Just teeing up, we're going to present the staffing request, vehicle request, and also outside agency donations that were requested by those outside agencies. For the staffing request, Carrie will present, and then vehicle request, Susan will get up and present that. Outside agencies, Melinda and Susan will tag team that. We don't have any representatives here today for any of the outside agencies, but of course, if you make a decision to invite them back for next week or the following week, we'd certainly coordinate that. On staffing and vehicle requests, Carrie and Susan will tee those up, but we do have representatives from all the departments if you have specific questions about their requests. So with that, I would just leave you with the idea that we did program in time toward the end of the meeting after Susan goes over the cash flow analysis forecast, and we discussed the highway fund for you to provide some direction on some of these requests. Of course, it's your decision what you do with them today, but I would leave it at that and invite Carrie up to go over the staffing.
Yeah, just for clarity, all staffing requests and vehicle requests are not included in the preliminary numbers that Susan presented us, and outside donations were left at the 2024 level.
Correct, and Susan will cover that again too as we get into it.
Thank you.
Okay. The total requests for next year look a little bit better than some previous years when you've been considering these. You have a total request for 12 new positions, and this spans all departments, including the highway, which of course comes out of the highway fund. So the very first request is a Veteran Services Officer for Human Services. The next is an investigator, or 2 investigators rather, for the Public Defender's Office. 2 paralegals for the State's Attorney's Office, 1 victim witness assistant for the State's Attorney's Office, an inventory specialist for the highway, a mechanic for the highway, a juvenile correctional officers 3 for JDC, and 3 juvenile correctional officers 1 for JDC. A couple of things to note for the JDC positions, you'll notice that it has a start date that's listed for July 2025. Jamie is proposing starting those mid-year, which is why you see the total cost slightly different than the annualized cost times 3. Another note is with the inventory specialist position, if this one is authorized, Steve is able to lower the amount that's budgeted in his variable hour budget, so it would be slightly offset by a reduction there of $20,598. The lower part of the slide shows you grant-funded positions. You'll probably remember a few years ago we started just talking about grant-funded positions, knowing that if the grant isn't funded for the future, you might be looking at a request from a department to continue the position. Right now, there's only one grant-funded position that we're tracking, and that's the victim witness assistant in the State's Attorney's Office. Technically, that was approved for funding from July 2023 to through June 2024. They are in the process of reapplying for the grant, and we hope to hear soon. Right now, for 2025, the part that's been funded by the county last year has been budgeted for 2025, and that's just 25%. The other 75% of the position is funded through the grant. And again, our hope is that that will be continued next year.
So are we talking about 2 separate positions, or is it one position that's going to lose grant funding that then we're going to county fund it?
For this, we're talking about one position, and it's basically just to keep it on your radar. It's budgeted at the same level that it has been in the past for 2025. The only reason we're bringing up is if by some chance the state's attorney's office doesn't have that grant funding approved for this upcoming year, then you might be looking at a request for either increasing the cost to the general fund by 75% to make up the difference, or possibly lowering the currently budgeted amount by 25%.
So bottom line is, we're not adding an additional person into the office. It's just more of the funding that is kind of,
Exactly, just to keep
Up
it
in
on
the
your
air.
radar.
Okay,
But the
thank you.
top part, those 12 are really your new position requests that you're looking at.
okay.
And then what we discussed about the retention bonuses, will that get added, does that get included here in this number per position, or?
No, we'll put that elsewhere. Yep, this is just the total cost of the position. So as you look at that number down the per position column, that is both salary and benefits for each position. So that 87,254 includes both the salary and FICA, insurance benefits, total cost for the position for a year. It goes somewhere else, yep. Any questions on that? And as Tom mentioned, department heads are here if you should have questions in the future.
Anybody want to go into each one of these individually, or would you like to just kind of finish and then bring this back at our next meeting? You know, just, we have it to look at now, to think about it, ask the questions publicly, or if you need to make a phone call to somebody to be able to do that. Just looking for input or thoughts from the commissioners.
I'm moving on and coming back to this personally.
Okay.
I'm fine with that too.
Yeah, I would like to have the opportunity to look at the whole story before we start working it with each chapter and finalizing those.
Okay. Sounds good.
Related to vehicle and equipment expense, it's a fairly short list this year. Within the general fund, the only department requesting vehicles is the sheriff's department. They're requesting one investigator vehicle and 6 patrol SUVs for a total of $340,000. As you're aware, they have a normal replacement schedule since their vehicles are pretty heavily used as they're out on the roads on a regular basis. The Museum Enterprise Fund via Bill Hoskins is requesting $50,000 for a van. And then the Highway Fund has 4 vehicles that they're requesting for $663,922. Representatives for each of those departments are here as well, so if you want to hear more about any of their vehicle requests, they're able to come up and speak to those if you would like to do it now or later.
I guess I'm going to jump in. Bill, the Ford van, is that going to be paid for out of your enterprise fund? Is that general funds from the county? How does that work?
My basic plan is to do a fund transfer from the store revenue and have the enterprise fund and the store fund pay for the van.
Okay. So taxpayer dollars aren't buying a van.
Right.
So, okay, thank you. Any other questions on vehicles?
Additionally, on that museum vehicle, since the museum is part of a joint budget with the city of Sioux Falls, that'll be part of that budget meeting as well later this summer. So I just wanted to note that as well.
Okay. I'm going to circle back real quick and call on Carrie real quick, Ben's. The Veteran Service Officer, how's that request coming, or can you talk to us a little bit about that? Generally, I'm supportive of it, but I know it's been kind of a work in progress. Can you help us with that request?
Okay, Carrie Benz, HS. Yes, we did consult with the South Dakota Department of Veterans Affairs and received information back, and this did go out to all of the other counties as well. And in this statement, it just identifies that their desire or their requirements for entering into discussions. They have identified that this passage of legislation is not intended to, nor will it replace the requirement that each county must have a veteran services officer as required, and they identified the statute. Instead, including the ability to contract with our department will address gaps in coverage in our counties or tribes with the smallest veteran populations where recruiting and retraining veteran service officers is prohibited. So they have identified they will work with the counties that either A, can't find a VSO, and there's advertising, if they're unsuccessful in being able to recruit a VSO, there has to be, I believe it's, they have to advertise for their vacancy for at least 180 days. And then ultimately, the decision still remains with them as to whether they can assist the county. And so we basically aren't, at this time, an option to contract with them.
So their interpretation of the statute is that they don't have to pay us if they don't want to for the VSO?
Correct. They get to pick who they will contract with. I did have the representative attorney from the SAO for us kind of look into that, and there is no language in what has been written as statute that identifies that they get to pick, but apparently they think they can.
They feel they got that authority. Interesting.
So for us at this time, to be able to contract with them is not an option. And they then also confirmed that they would not be paying their piece of that pie, I think like $5,100 or, yeah. They wouldn't be paying that either.
Yeah.
So it's on us.
And Mr. Chair, I think if we're paying for it either way, I think we'd rather do it ourselves than contract with them anyway. But yeah, it's definitely a frustrating item because the legislature spent a lot of time on this. I know a few legislators that you're well aware of too. I think every time we see certain legislators, they talk about the VSO program and how the counties need to have more VSOs, but they didn't really meet us halfway on any of the costs. This is just us, because we're going from, this request would go from 1 to 2.
Correct.
So we'd be doubling our VSO budget with no commensurate support from the state. So, I mean, I'm generally supportive of that. I think also that Carrie can fill in the gaps too on the personnel issue here of, we went from having that one VSO was a relatively long time, very successful, well thought of employee, and she left. Mm-hmm. And so obviously we have a learning curve of a newer person coming in, but there's still a lot of veterans to be served. So going from 1 to 2 might be justified from kind of just the business objectives, but it is going to be a cost.
And that's kind of what I'm looking for too, is that justification. Is it being mandated to us? Is it just we see the need that we really need to have a second one? Fill that in for me if you can help me out.
We aren't being mandated. The counties are required to have a VSO, to which we meet that. But we're at a point in a juncture where there are just so many veterans within the Minnehaha County perimeter that they're taxed, they're pushed. Tyler is now our new VSO, recently started, and he hit the ground running fast. And it's been a little bit of a drag just because he's had to learn Vetrospect, which is their computer system. And then he also had to pass the tests in order to be able to qualify to be able to do the work and to access that service. So there's been that little bit of a drag, but he honestly has been seeing people pretty much, I would say probably starting week 3. The first couple of weeks he was at the VA learning their system. But other than that, he's been starting to see people and has been seeing people already and is pretty much on a dead run. So I think in order to best service and provide the care that's needed for the veterans, in all reality, we're just at that juncture where it's the tipping point.
So let me ask you, because historically or in the past, the request for a VSO has also come from like the Alliance, and they said, house them here. Where do you expect to house this person?
We will house them within HS,
Okay.
just so there'll be neighbor offices with the current VSO. I think a lot of what we would need to evaluate and will depend on the VSO to help us identify that. I think we'll do a lot more outreach, which is something that the state has requested that the VSOs that are at the county level do. And Tyler does that, but the hard part is when he's out, there's no one in the office then to take the walk-ins and the phone calls and those type of things. So honestly, I think it'd be evaluating if one is out, the other's in. And so we try to cover both bases at the same time.
Thank you. Sorry, I circled back. Now we can go back to where we were. If anybody remembers where that is. Okay.
We were on vehicle requests, and if there's no more questions at this juncture on that, we can transition into outside agencies. So any further questions or dialogue on vehicle requests?
I just have one because I've forgotten. How many sheriff patrol vehicles do we have in total? Because I know we rotate, but I can't remember how many we're rotating.
Yes, good question. So patrol vehicles, marked patrol vehicles that you see on the streets, we have around 26 patrol
20,
vehicles.
yep. Thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Kipley wants all the VNI numbers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you for all the VIN numbers too, put you on the spot, but but in all seriousness, so you said 24, 26? So on basically, is it kind of like a 4-year rotation then, or is that if I'm 6 patrol cars and this is just a regular cycle, we kind of have them on 4 or 5 years?
Correct. Depending on the usage, some of them are assigned as supervisor or take-home vehicles, and so we can get a little more life out of them. We do also, after they have a patrol life, they go to their second life, which would be either the jail, JDC, safe home, human services, our detective vehicles. We try to reuse as much as we can, get as much tread off those tires before they get retired.
Yeah, no, these look like kind of just planned, baked in expenses to me, so I don't have any issues with the sheriff vehicle request.
Okay.
And all of these vehicle request dollars are included in the means of finance that you've been presented thus far. Okay, we'll transition into outside agency budget requests. I think Melinda's gonna kick us off.
Yep.
Hello, Melinda Storley, Commission Office. For your consideration, the following organizations have submitted funding requests for fiscal year 2025 to help support programs they provide which align with certain county services. Now, mandated by statute is Southeastern Behavioral. There is no increase. The rate is set at $1 per capita based on the state census for 2022. Funds subsidize outpatient services for individual counseling, family and group therapy, and psychiatric services. Now, Southeastern Behavioral also receives a donation for both drug court and mental health court. They each receive $5,000. Contract dues, we've got Humane Society, who's requesting $75,000. That's a $23,000 increase from last year. They provide animal control in Minnehaha and shelter care for detained animals. One thing to note with their request is that their after-hours fee will increase from $58 to $90 per hour. Sioux Empire Fair is requesting a $100,000 increase from last year. The reason for their increase is to support escalating costs of maintenance, equipment, and payroll. Southeastern Council of Governments, it's our annual membership dues. The 3% increase is to coincide with the customer price index factor provided by the state, and they help facilitate our grant applications for the county. Fiscal year 25 outside agency applications were distributed March 18th. They had 6 weeks to submit their funding request packet. The application packet consists of a letter of request, financial information, statistics on services provided, and current board members. Donations are from general funds. I'm only going to highlight those that requested a high increase. One of them is Children's Home Shelter. Their increase is $20,000 from last year, so they want $120,000. They also receive $26,800. That's 40% of the the Domestic Abuse Fund. If you recall, domestic abuse funds are sourced from marriage fees and divorce fees, not general funds. They need the funding to help meet the demand for services since federal and state funding continues to decrease and fluctuate from year to year. The next group that requested a high increase is the Lutheran Social Services Family Violence Project. They're requesting $58,580. That's a $22,880 increase. The funding supports the Family Violence Project. It's 10 group programs for clients referred from courts, child protection services, and some self-referrals. Another large increase on their request is Sioux Falls Development Foundation. They're asking for $25,000. They usually receive $510, so their increase is $24,490. Their rationale for making a request with such a large increase is that their contribution in promoting the recent private industry growth in Parks 8 and Foundation Park has positively affected property tax collection for Minnehaha County by millions of dollars. Another large increase is Sioux Metro Growth Alliance. They're requesting $15,000. They usually receive $4,000, so their increase is $11,000. Their fund increase is crucial to sustaining and expanding programs for economic prosperity. We have 3 new requests this year. The Compass Center is requesting $45,000. They did not receive any funding last year other than, again, domestic abuse funds. They received 20%, which is $13,400. Their additional funding is requested due to the increasing demand for services and programs that provide vital support for those affected by the escalating rate of sexual and domestic violence in Minnehaha County. The Family Visitation Center, they're requesting $27,500. They did not receive anything last year, again, other than the Domestic Abuse Fund. They received 40%, $26,800. They serve families seeking supervised visits for cases referred by Child Protection Services or the courts and are requesting additional funding to support above the domestic abuse fund amount that they receive. They'd like to apply that funding towards 1-hour visits for private families which are referred by the courts. Just a note with them, they relocated to the Avera facility in 2020, and Avera provided IT and phone services for them. The staff was considered Avera employee for payroll benefits and required training. But Avera did turn around and bill Family Visitation Center for those services, and they would have to reimburse them from their budget. So Family Visitation Center is, their nonprofit status dissolved around October 2023, and they reinstated as a cost center under Avera governance, doing business as Family Visitation Center, just a note there. Also new is Think 3D Solutions. You received a briefing from Tammy and Dysert this morning. So again, his request is $21,250, and they'd like to apply that to a Leaders of Tomorrow pilot program for their new nonprofit Bridging the Gap. The ambulances have already, 3 ambulance services have requested $90,000. It's a $15,000 increase for all of them, but I'd like to share with you why they want the increase. Del Rapids would like to be able to start setting about $300,000 aside to purchase a fire truck in 5 years. Garrettson, they'd primarily like to use it for salary support and wage increases and required staff hires due to the decline in volunteerism. And Humboldt, they'd like to help support salaries for the 3 new weekend EMT paid shifts.
Thank you, Melinda. So it's an interesting list, and you know, the mission or the goal of each one of these is mostly, you know, nonprofit and very much community supportive. And I know that you have quite a full file of all the justifications and the requests for it. So I guess from the commission, next week, would you like to have anybody from any of these organizations going down the list to ask questions of?
I was thinking that maybe the Family Visitation Center,
Would be a good one?
because of their position with Avera.
Okay, okay. Yeah, and that does raise an interesting point. I agree. Commissioners, what are your thoughts?
Can we clarify that that Think 3D Solutions Bridging the Gap is duplicative with the grant application, or are they two completely separate? Because I just think we would probably not fund this in this category if we're just pursuing the grant. We could always reconsider how we help them programmatically in the future, but I think we're all in on the grant as of today.
It is duplicative. Obviously, the grant provides more funding for them. However, we, for the purpose of this presentation, kept it in. And I would recommend keeping it in for now. We, probably not the best budgeting practice, but it is only $21,000 in this particular budget until we get more fidelity on the prospects of receiving the grant. But it is duplicative. And I would say if the grant's received, then there would not be a need necessarily to allocate these funds to them.
I'm going from memory, but didn't we in the past give Compass Center some in-kind office space before we started remodeling? Or am I wrong about that?
I wouldn't have an answer to that.
I don't remember that.
Oh, maybe I'm hallucinating. I could have swore we did.
I don't recall.
Okay, I'll double check.
Yeah, we'll look into it and get back to you.
So, yeah, let Melinda know sometime this week if you want her to reach out to any of these outside agencies to have them present next week when we go through this. And, yeah.
And just to add a couple of points, the ones under the contract and dues, those increases, because they're contractually related, those have been included in the budget thus far. None of the other changes have been included, the other requests.
So is
the animal control and CCOG dues those changes have been reflected into the budget thus far. And then additionally on the domestic abuse fund, just to clarify, we have the budget at $67,000, but if we collect more money into that fund, we pay out on that allocation basis. So that's why you can see in the prior years, 1 year it was just over 69,000, 1 year was 68,000, because it stays fairly consistent in that 67 to 69,000 mark. So it does fluctuate slightly, but not significantly.
so whatever that collects, we divide 40, 40, 20.
Correct, and we pay it out a quarter in arrears, so.
And, okay.
And are those the only agencies that receive funding, that no other funds go to anyone
Not under
else?
the domestic abuse fund, so Amanda kind of briefed a little bit on what fees go into that fund when she did her Register of Deeds presentation, but statute gives the commission discretion to do the grants to the applicable types of agencies that would meet the requirements. And so the 40-40-20 split has been there for a number of years, ever since I've been here, but I've only been here about 3 years, so.
Yeah. Anybody remember, commissioners, when it went 40, 40, 20? Was there some?
It was when, it was one of my first couple years on the commission, and it was advocated by a former commissioner to allocate some money to Family Visitation Center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so there's no magic to it. It's just, yeah.
That's my recollection. There's no magic.
So, okay. I'm just looking at Compass's request and for the additional 21, and if it was 35, 35, 30, would that make a big difference? And it probably wouldn't impact enough to offset their. Who's asking? Yeah, they both want additional.
Right, and Family Visitation Center, if you go back and you look at the last couple of years, they did receive about 27,000 with the actual allocations. Last year was a little bit under 27,000 because of how much we brought in. So they potentially could have just put 27,500 in there, looking at their historical average of what they've gotten for the domestic abuse fund. But because we had received an extra request for Compass Center over and above that estimated allocation, we just treated them the same.
Melinda had made the comment that on a few of these that basically they're providing court-ordered services. Yeah. Do they break out any of the costs of those court-ordered services in their request? No? Okay.
Some of them do a pretty good job of explaining how much their deficit is, like per visitation, things like that. But I think those are those questions. If you want to go deeper than what was in their application, we could certainly bring them back in to go through that in more detail.
Commissioner?
I was thinking to Commissioner Benniga's question, I think maybe you're thinking of CASA, because we did have CASA over at the
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I do have another question. Some of these I'm fairly familiar with, and they do have endowment programs. Do they give us balance sheets that show us either restricted and unrestricted funds?
Many of them did. Some of the smaller organizations maybe don't have an audit, but
Right.
many of them, if they were audited, they did include that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. And we'll have time at the end of today's session if you want to have more dialogue on this or give direction on these as we go. Moving into just a cash applied illustration to kind of give you a sense of where we're at. We've given you two scenarios, a scenario one and a scenario two. Don't take this as the auditors or the commission office's recommendation on what we do. It's just to give you a view of what something could potentially look like. This top section is the same on both scenarios. That is the current budget for the general fund for the means of finance. So that cash applied of $8,509,000 is what you saw earlier in the day. So that is a 9.56% cash applied. As we've talked about before, 8% has historically been our target. If you were to, let's say, fund all of those general fund positions, keep in mind 2 of those positions were highway funds, so they're not reflected in this number. That would bring your cash applied to just over 9.2 million with an 8% target of about 7.1. So you'd be roughly over by 2.1 on your cash applied target. And so that would be about a 10.4% cash applied rate. And if you were to fund all outside agency donations under scenario 2, just to kind of give you a view, that would increase your cash applied up to 10.71%. That is if you did not have any other changes to revenue or expenses within the budget, or we didn't do any additional opt-out. That would mean we would be going into our cash applied or our reserves an additional $2.1 to $2.4 million. So as we go forward, we kind of wanted to show you what the forecast looks like. If you take our current budget and roll that forward a few years, what does that look like? So that's where we get into this forecast and cash analysis scenario. Just to level set what this includes, we're starting with 2019 and 2023 actual results. So we've left that data on the slide. Includes 24 revised budget. 25 budget includes all of the requested positions, so you can kind of see what it would look like. None of the outside agency donations. And then what we've done is add factors for growth, CPI, matrix, opt-outs, et cetera. All of that are just assumptions based upon current thoughts, but again, those are not set in stone. And then we've also included the additional costs for UC3 expansion in the jail, for going into that vacant floor in the jail, as well as adding about $750,000 a year of new positions annually in the forecast. So when we get into what all that means and when we look into the forecast, what it looks like. So this is a slide similar to what you've seen in the past. So you can see the blue blue bar here is revenue, and the orange bars are expenses. And then this green line is our opt-out, and then this blue bar here is our cash. And so you can see with 23, with our strong financial year with revenues exceeding expenses, we did bring in additional cash in 23 for our reserves. And then currently with 24, we're projecting to increase that cash. But as we move into the forecast with ARPA going away and the usage of those COVID relief dollars, we expect that cash to come back down. So with that goal, by the time we get to 2029, we want to be at a minimum of a 25% of unassigned fund balance. So that's where you're bringing that cash balance back down as we're layering in opt-out over the next few years.
So it'll take us 4 years to get to 25%.
And you can do that quicker, but that means you would have a higher increase in opt-out or a higher financial impact in the subsequent years because you would use all of that cash in 1 year. And with the goal of trying to smooth things in, this is an example of how it could look when you're slowly incrementing that cash, usage of that cash down over the next couple of years.
And
So when you get into the assumptions, and just so that you can know what goes into that slide, inflation and growth, we have inflation slowly coming back down. I do not have a crystal ball on any of this, so do not get locked in on any of these numbers per se, because they are all just an estimate. They will be different. Growth, again, we're at 3.36% and slowly having a decline in growth. If you look at history on growth, it goes up, it comes back down. So that's why we're showing it that way. Group insurance, we just have that standard 8% that we talked about earlier. The payroll matrix adjustment, I have just mirrored inflation. So whatever inflation is what I have in for a matrix adjustment. So you can see here, I've kind of adjusted the cash applied throughout the next few years using more cash applied or reserves to use that cash to get us down to that 25% metric. And then as you go throughout 26 through 29, using and levying more and opt-out as we go forward. Again, these numbers will change, but kind of gives you an idea of what that trajectory looks like. And this does include UC3 expansion and new positions every year, knowing that we'll have to probably evaluate something every year.
What is our 2024 opt-out right now?
We have 2.1 million.
No, total, because I mean on there it's showing
15.5 million is our current amount that we're levying.
how much?
15.5. So this number here is our current amount.
That doesn't change, okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So in this scenario, we look at potentially levying that additional opt-out under our current capacity in 2026, and then potentially using new opt-out in 2026. When you get into 27, we'll have that one opt-out of $1,625,000 expiring, so we'll have to look at how that's replaced.
And that's
So-
a building fund opt-out though.
No, this is general fund opt-out. This is all general fund. So in 2027, we'll have an opt-out that will drop off. So we do have one in the building fund that will drop off in 26, but this is a general fund opt-out that will drop off in 2027.
Okay.
So again, don't get set on any of the numbers per se, but just the trajectory. And I can go back to the previous slide if you want to see the graph. And if you have questions.
Could I ask one question or make one comment?
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, I think in the past couple of years, we've talked about a goal of smoothing out tax increases for taxpayers.
And to the extent that is the goal that you're trying to accomplish here in tandem with the bringing the cash down, then I'm fully supportive of that. I'm still fully in the camp that I think taxpayers appreciate predictable, slow increases as opposed to a big jump in a year. So from that point, I think this makes sense.
So that would mean, go to the next slide. Approving an opt-out for 2.5 million, but not using it just to smooth them in? Is that what you're talking about? I mean, is that the idea here?
Correct. This is kind of based upon the FAN recommendation that we should be pursuing an opt-out prior to the year that we need it. So potentially, if 2024 budget is dead on, that there's no variance, that we would look at utilizing additional cash applied next year, but we would want to start streamlining in some of that. So in theory, you could say, you know what, we're going to go up to a 13% cash applied and not take any of that additional opt-out in 26. But what that would mean is the next year you have to make that up, because you aren't going to be able to spend your reserves down every year and keep them at a level that we need to keep them at if you spend them down too fast. Because you're eventually going to have to make it up somehow. So this is just showing how if we met our 2024 budget, this is what this would look like, so that we can continue smoothing in opt-out without having to levy too much additional every year too quickly, so that we don't have a big spike in opt-out. And FAN's recommendation was that we pursue it before we need it. So that 2.5 million number, is that the magic number? Based upon this scenario, yes. But the actual numbers for next year are obviously going to be different based upon what inflation and what a matrix adjustment looks like, et cetera.
Have you looked, so just say the year 2029, or currently we're at 25% of our funding through opt-out. 2029, with that additional, I mean, we're looking at $3, $6, $9, $10 million, or is it going to jump
You're
up?
going to start tipping up into that 30% of our tax
30,
load.
that's my question. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as you get down into, like 27, part of what you're going to have to pass is not only the new opt-out that would be needed, because as we talk about through 26 and through 28, you're adding considerable expenses for that UC3 expansion that's factored into this.
Okay.
But you're also replacing that 1,625,000. So you would have a new opt-out of, on this scenario, 4,200,000, but 1.6 of that is really dropping off and replacing.
UC3 expansion, I got their attention. Are we on track for that? I thought maybe we backed off a little bit on our forecast. Can you enlighten us at all on that?
Sure. Jeff Gromer with the Sheriff's Office. We have actually backed off quite substantially. We'd budgeted to start expanding into that this year. Now we've pushed that off. Or did we settle on 1.5 years, didn't we?
For the staff to be hired in
Right.
mid-25.
In mid-25? So we've been able to push that off a full year, and we'll continue to evaluate that based on our jail numbers.
So the current budget projection is the expansion for half a year for UC3 in 25. Okay.
Right. Which we'll reevaluate again as we get closer to that and see where our jail number's at, and we'll continue to push that off.
What's your window on that? I mean, it's not like you hire a correctional officer and put him on the floor. I mean,
No, it's gonna take us, once we decide to start, a year and a half to get those fully hired. It was about a year to 18 months to hire the folks to expand into the current expansion we're occupying. So we'll be in that range.
okay.
But at present, our jail numbers are, I need to find some wood to knock on, but they're shockingly good. So we're very happy with that and really, really comfortable pushing that off.
Okay.
I mean, the great news is that was supposed to have been money being spent right now, and
Correct.
so.
So
Okay, thank you.
In the 24 budget, we did have 14 FTEs for 50% of 2024. So those same 14 FTEs are in the 25 budget at half a year. And so as you move forward on the forecast, you have additional increases in expense in 26 and 28. So that's what's reflected in that forecast. And additionally, we've reflected additional bed revenue as well. So we've tried to include both the expenses and the revenue that would come from that expansion.
And that's kind of always a question. I mean, if we have the facility, could we increase our revenue? Is the demand out there from Marshal Service or et cetera, where we could do that? We have the store, why aren't we using it?
I think we could. At best, we're probably looking at a wash.
Break even?
That would be the best outcome that I would envision for us, is that it would be a break-even situation. Probably for the operations of the jail and the staff at the jail, it'd be a net loss, even if we break even financially, because what we would get out of that is we'd probably be able to fill them up, but we're gonna get other places problems. And I don't know that that's a win for us,
Okay.
Particularly too when we consider the fact that there's a very good likelihood that when these folks come to stay with us and then they get released,
They stay?
we're gonna release them out here, and I don't know if that's the best idea.
So we don't want other people's problems is what you're telling me.
I'd like to not inherit those if I can, but I think financially we could probably break even.
Okay,
That's about what we'd be looking at.
thank you for that.
I think that is something that we have discussed in the past as well, and decided that we really, we built the jail, and we're going to staff the jail to meet the needs of Minnehaha County and close partners like Lincoln County, but that we really aren't in the business of making
Jail.
money off of a jail. So, which I think has worked well for us.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Susan, I really appreciate this slide and how you help us every year think about smoothing out the increases, but I'm wondering if you can tell me, has it changed from last year's slide coming off a favorable year? Has that changed anything in how this looks this year?
The trajectory is the same. The trajectory of where we were at last year, it's very similar. This is a little higher from a cash perspective than where we were a year ago, just because the interest rates are so high. Jail border prisoner revenue is higher. Expenses came in less. So, I factor in on this scenario the 5% holdback that we're factoring in, and that 3% under utilization of expenses. So I factor that in, assuming that we're going to meet that 8% cash applied target. So in that case for 23, revenue is high, expenses were lower, and that brings that blue line higher because we brought in more revenue, more cash than we had originally anticipated. But what that does is allow you to have a little bit more as you go down here to maybe not have to increase opt-out as quickly. But the trajectory is the same. You end up at the same place. The exact numbers are going to be a little different, but we will continue to have to evaluate opt-outs as part of our plan because the growth and CPI that we are getting are not equating to increases in service needs within the county.
So if 2024 looked like 2023, as far as revenue higher, expenses lower, how much, would that be a big impact on that graph?
Yeah, so if we, so this increases cash, from 23 to 24. Just looking at this, maybe about 5 million is what that number looks like. I have the exact numbers on my spreadsheet that builds this up. But if that, let's say we bring an additional 1 million over that, that's going to bring that up just a little bit more, and then we would bring that down. So again, you could look at maybe it not using that opt-out here of maybe you don't need a new opt-out levied, that you would utilize that extra cash as we move forward.
Okay.
In theory, you could bring that cash down considerably over the next couple of years and not do any of these opt-outs, but then what's going to happen is eventually you're going to have to bring it in quite a bit all in 1 year.
Okay.
And so what we're trying to do with this slide is to show you how to layer that in. And this is something every year we're going to have to carefully manage. Going up to a cash applied target of 11% is a little uncomfortable, knowing that it's using reserves. But we also know that we have been building our reserves up with the preparation of our ARPA expiring. And so now we need to start doing that to bring those down a little bit and layer that in.
I think Commissioner Bender's words are keep taxes predictable. I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Oh, no, that's okay. I mean, and you just mentioned the word that I've been thinking about is ARPA, because we haven't talked a lot about that today, but if you could flip to that other slide. I mean, really, we have been using ARPA money to help keep our taxes low because we've been using it to pay for a lot of operating costs, and we've been talking in years up to this about ARPA money is going to end. And then at that point, we have no other choice. The legislature's really given us no other tools to meet our expenses, provide the services that taxpayers want and expect, but through opt-out. And then we're trying to do that in the most responsible way we can.
And as we talked earlier about that cap on CPI, our expenses have gone up these last few years when we've had a period of higher CPI. But our tax revenue growth is not able to keep up with that because of the requirements where CPI is capped at 3%. And so that's where this line here for opt-out, in theory, would be over $5 million less if CPI would be able to be increased at actual CPI. So it wouldn't solve our opt-out needs, but it is part of why we have to opt out, especially in these last few years where inflation has been quite a bit higher. And next week on the 18th, we are prepared to kind of dive a little bit in and give you a summary of ARPA so you can know what those expenses have been. But it's between 6 to 8 million a year that we've been using on regular ongoing expenses. And, we've been talking about that for 2 years now. And so we've been preparing for that, but that time will be here next year.
All righty. So our schedule says that commission discussion and direction on requests, I think, is where we're at. Is that right? No, we're not there yet? Oh, okay.
Do we go into the
highway?
Okay. Well, and just maybe a couple of closing slides on this. And we've talked about this, fiscal challenges identified in the forecast. UC3 expansion is going to be needed to address the needs of the growing jail population. So that's factored in. Ongoing public safety needs for staffing will continue to be there for the sheriff's office, public defender, state's attorney, public advocate. Just as population continues to grow, those needs are going to be there. We need to keep a good management on our cash balances so that we maintain adequate unapplied cash balances so that we can maintain our bond rating as we move forward. And then again, that cap on CPI is not helping when we look at our forecast as we move forward. Now we'll move into the highway fund. And I'll kick it off and then Steve will be coming up to present a few things with it. So as we move into the highway fund summary, you've seen the slide in prior years. For 2023, the highway fund ended up with a cash balance of just over $10.2 million. They are estimated to bring in, from a budget perspective, $16.8 million in revenue. And their expenditures are budgeted for 2024 with $20.4 million. That it does include their 23 carryover budget that they carried into 24. So they are looking at using some of their cash reserves of about $3.6 million. So for 2024, they're ending the year at current state at about $6.6 million ending cash reserve. Their requested budget shows a $17.1 million 2025 for revenue, a $19.6 million in expense, ending the year with about a $4.1 million cash balance. Steve is here if you want to talk through. At least I think he is still. So if you have questions on this, on his budget, and then he will be covering the next two slides. So.
Okay. Hey, Steve.
Good afternoon, Steve Groen, Highway Superintendent. Any questions on the highway fund summary? There's been no policy established on what our target cash reserve should be for the highway fund, but in theory, we're always the goal is to keep it about $3.5, $4 million. It gotten pretty high the last couple of years, which is a good problem to have, and we've been slowly trying to spend it down to that $4 million mark. One of the big issues that we've been facing, just like every other agency, is the rising costs of construction costs. Part of our issue is that our revenues, although strong, have been holding steady for the most part for the last 10 years. The green line on here is our revenues, which does not count like big funds, the state funds we get. These are the funds that we actually count on. That's our wheel tax and the other sources of revenue that we count on every year. And you can see that our revenues have been holding pretty steady and actually went down just slightly from 23 to be what our budget would be for this year. I think in reality, the way wheel tax revenues and other revenues are coming in this year, they'll probably be flat compared to 2023. But at the same time, our maintenance costs and our construction costs have been rising quite rapidly. They've started to come down a little bit this year, but the red line in there is our square footage cost for our pavement overlays. That's when we go out and do add 1.5 inches to 2 inches of pavement to try to extend the life of a road. The other two lines are our microsurfacing and our chip seal. Those costs have been rising a little bit slower, but they are trending up as, fortunately, the last year now, oil is a big driver on all three of those products, and oil costs have been lower than anticipated, so those pricings have been pretty good. But we did do our pavement management analysis this last year. The commission will be getting a briefing in late July on that, and our recommended maintenance per year to be spent to maintain our ride quality has increased just under $1 million a year based on the recommendations from our consultant.
Commissioner
Benega. You were successful, excuse me, in receiving some state grants this year of about $3 million. Where is that included, or is it included in the estimated highway revenue? Because your highway revenue stayed flat.
As I stated, this is our typical revenue that we anticipate every year, but does not include the state grants.
Okay.
Out in this scenario right here. We did get $3.1 million, but those are for projects that are going to happen over the next 2 years.
Wheel tax, $4
Correct.
a wheel, up to 4 wheels.
Yep.
I mean, I would think in 10 years, the number of vehicles has increased dramatically, but it doesn't seem like the wheel tax has.
I was surprised that when we ran these numbers that our revenues have gone up, but the wheel tax, do we have an actual chart on what the actual collections were?
Don't have it in here, but we could have it for next.
Yeah, we could have that for next week and what the actual amount, it goes up some every year. This year we're up over last year, but
Yeah, our population's increasing.
it's never real significant. It's 100,000, 200,000 a year. Just
Interesting.
I got to go back to my previous question.
Yes.
So the 3.1 is not in the requested budget number?
That is not on the 24, it would be in 25. This is what our actual, and then what our budget was for this year. If you added the 3 million this year would be up here, but in discussions about how to best talk about where the current state of the revenues are, because we can't count on getting big grants every year. We've been successful the last 2 years, but we've been unsuccessful other years. This is our, how do we state that? This is our anticipated revenues that we can count on every year, the recurring revenues.
Grants are passed through.
Correct.
I mean, money in, money out, it's for the same
Yep.
thing. Okay.
Here's a summary of our wheel tax distributions. This is what each, this is over 2 slides. The Minnehaha County gets about 90% of the wheel tax collected, and then 5% is distributed amongst the townships, and the other 5% is distributed amongst the cities. So I'll go to the next page here. So this is with the $4 wheel tax, and then if we did do an increase to a $5 wheel tax, the center column shows what the numbers would have been in 2023. And the third column is the additional monies that the townships and the cities and the highway department would receive from that extra dollar wheel, $4 total.
This might be a strange question. I'm going to ask it.
Yeah.
How do we know how many wheels a vehicle has?
It's a part of the registration card that the state gets.
Okay. I've said it many times in the past, and I still have a hang-up with it. To me, the wheel tax is kind of an unevenly levied tax because if you have, most cars have 4 wheels, obviously, but you know, the heavier commercial vehicles, I mean, you can have 18 wheels. I think the state limits the wheel tax at 12. Is that right?
I believe that is correct.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, or in my mind, a 12-wheeled vehicle causes more wear and tear than a 4-wheeled vehicle, but yet they pay the same wheel tax.
I
Has
couldn't
there
disagree.
been any consideration or thought to, you know, maybe adding a wheels 5 through 12, $1 a wheel? Maybe we wouldn't know what that would bring in, but would that at least give us a basis to determine?
That's a question I could ask the Department of Revenue. I did ask them about vehicles that are over 6,000 gross vehicle weight because the next point I was gonna make is to get the extra 2 points on the big funds. The ruling is that you have to apply, if you get the $5 for vehicles over 6,000 gross vehicle weight, that would qualify for your for your extra 2 big fund points. And so I did get some information from the DOR about how many vehicles that would apply to, and it was about 22,000 vehicles in Minnehaha County, so that would increase the wheel tax about $88,000 a year, but we'd still get our funds. But I could ask them if we would get up to 12 wheels, how many vehicles that would apply for.
And my justification for it is at least the 90% of the taxpayers would see no increase because they'd still be paying $4.
Yeah.
It would just be the increase on the additional wheels. I have a lot of contractors who are probably watching this and not happy with me, but I don't know how that all applies, but you know, it's just, to me,
It's a good question to get an answer on, so I can work on that. But I did, in your handouts, all our surrounding counties, we did check, and they all are $5 wheel tax right now. And I believe all but McCook County go up with a max of $60 where they're assessing on all 12 wheels. McCook County is a max of $20 with a $5 wheel tax.
interesting.
And Steve,
Yes.
can you tell me again how many structures it is that this would be beneficial for?
It would be the structures that we are applying for big funds, we get 2 extra points. We did have one a year and a half ago, we submitted for a bridge over Skunk Creek on our Highway 110 east of Colton, and it was a $1.8 million request where we had gotten 80% funding, so about $1.6 million in state funding, and we missed out by 1.5 points.
Do you anticipate that if we did this, it would just be from here on going forward, we'd be at $5 per wheel, or was it to achieve a goal for a period of time?
It would be to achieve the goal permanently, I would anticipate. It wouldn't be an interim increase.
Okay.
But that would always be up to any future commission. You know, the commission can change the wheel tax at any time.
So we could go $4 a wheel to a maximum, with no maximum wheels, but a maximum of $20 a vehicle. That's what other counties have done?
Some, the other counties that have a $5 with a 20, it would be based on 4 wheels, a max of 20. But other counties have $5 with a max of 12 wheels. We could go $4, and instead of doing a max of 4 wheels, we could see what the numbers would be to go $4 with a max of 12 wheels, but then also we could also do the vehicles over 6,000 gross vehicle weight at $5, and then we'd get our extra big fund points.
Okay. And that could impact that point.
Yeah, just
That's
as long as vehicles over 6,000 gross vehicle weight are at $5, then we get the extra points for the big fund.
Okay.
There are a few counties in the state that do charge less for vehicles under 6,000 pounds. I went through all the counties, and there was a handful of counties that do charge differently for heavier vehicles.
And there's some counties with no wheel tax.
Correct. There's 2, I believe.
What kind of vehicle are we talking with that 6,000 pounds?
That'd be a 1-ton or heavier truck, more than likely.
And in your opinion, does that logic follow that those vehicles that are over that limit do create more wear and tear or require more of your services for repair?
Heavy weights correlate with road maintenance needs.
How would that still get broken out similarly to the townships? Because I know that's definitely true on township roads too.
Correct. It would be any increase or any decrease in wheel tax would be reflected to all the townships and cities that get distribution. It's a percentage of the amount collected by the county.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm certain this part of the discussion will carry over into next week, so it's a good basis to start with, and maybe a few questions that you can bring answers back for us next week. So, okay.
And if I could, actually, one more thought. If we increase the wheel tax, your revenue is going to go up, and if you have higher points, you're likely to receive more assistance with future projects. So that's a benefit for the highway budget both ways. What would that, how could we explain how that would be beneficial to taxpayers?
We'll take the bridge on Highway 104 west of Del Rapids that we let earlier this year. We didn't score high enough. I don't know if the 2 points would have been enough, but we were 3.5 points short of getting funding when we applied a year and a half ago. You can change the amount of percent grant you're getting, where we could reapply for a lesser grant and maybe get some money. But on a $2 million project, those extra 2 points, instead of getting 80% funding, I'd have to ask for 75% funding, which is an extra $100,000 that comes out of our budget. Say the bridge on 110, if we're unable to get big funding and have to do it in-house, then it's say $2 million that's coming direct out of the highway fund, like that bridge on 104, instead of getting maybe 75% of it funded by the state if we're successful in getting big funding. So the more points we can get, the better luck we have on getting the state funding, which makes more funding available to do other work on other township bridges and our county highway system.
I guess my question comes down to then, in theory, that would increase your ending cash reserve in future years.
More than likely, yes.
So would there be a corresponding decrease in your projected budgets going forward?
We're able to do more with less county funds, the more state funding or federal funding we're able to get to do projects. So in theory, if we got more funding, being it's a reimbursement, our budget might actually, for projects, would go up, knowing that we'd be paying $2 million up front for a bridge, but we'd get $1.6 million back at the conclusion. So it's
it's, it depends on the workload.
Okay, thank you.
Any changes to the wheel tax, of course, are referable. When would we have to make a decision by? Is that, there's a deadline to do that for 2025? Anybody know?
Mr. Chair, it's traditionally been done in August or September, prior to passage of the budget.
Okay. Okay. All right. It's kind of a conundrum because we can increase the revenues, which means we'd get more grants, but then that lowers our expenses. So I think that's what you were driving at. And the light came on as you were asking the question, so I appreciate
But
that.
actually, our expenses are gonna go up anyways, just, our maintenance budget, pavement management budget, we've already increased it $1 million for next year, more than anticipating, based on recommendations from our pavement consultant earlier this year. So our extra revenues we're gonna be using on pavement management to keep our ride quality high.
Okay. Any other questions for Steve?
All right.
I think we're good.
All right.
Onward and upward.
All right, so the last slide here, then I'll turn it over to Susan for any of her final thoughts for today. The 25 budget that was proposed, presented to you today is deliverable. Obviously, there's some decisions that need to be made by the commission, but we do want you to continue thinking about this idea of the opt-out. You know, it's certainly a necessary consideration to maintain our required levels of service. And as Susan mentioned earlier, just the timing is very important when it comes to your consideration. And then also, you know, we do have challenges associated with a growing county. And, you know, as in the past, you know, it just requires that thoughtful, strategic approach to fiscal management. Susan, did you have anything to add? So what I would say, Mr. Chair, at this point, I think what staff would be looking for, and this is not all-inclusive, is just some direction on staffing, vehicles, outside agency donations. What I think I heard is that you would like to continue the discussion on those next week. So I'll, you know, certainly give it back to you to discuss as a commission on what you want to see next week. And then I have some recommendations here too as to how that meeting could look next week. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Yay. Anybody have specific requests or thoughts? I know we've been here for over 5 hours now. So we'll head into next week and kind of make some hard decisions on outside agencies and opt-outs, et cetera.
I don't have any specific additional information I want right now. I just want to be able to think through what we've been provided, and I know how to reach out to people if I want more information.
That suggests that if you do want outside agencies or somebody to bring additional information, to get it to Tom by Friday so that those arrangements can be made for people to show up and have that conversation. So, all right. I'm going to assume we're done with the budget process and open this up for public comment. Sheriff? No? Okay. Oh, okay. And we all want to. All right. No public comment. I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So, second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. And the department heads, thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Your presence is definitely recognized, and
Yeah.
it's an interesting
Susan,
process.
thank you for putting this all together. This is a big project.
Will you go back to work or did you take the whole day off?
I told them I might see them if I got done early, but now that we're done earlier.
I am going to go back to work. The person I work with mostly is out the rest of the week.